Good afternoon, everybody. We are now going to resume. You've had exactly 2 minutes break, and I'm going to behave like a typical ex-TUC official, chairing briskly to make sure that we have plenty of time for our speakers and our debate for the second part of today's workshop. I'm Sarah Veale. I was formerly Head of Equality and Employment Rights at the TUC. I'm a member of the executive of the History and Policy Trade Union and Employment Forum. And since my retirement in 2015, I've been doing various bits and pieces of work for, amongst others, the Wales government, the Fair Work Commission there, the Women's Budget Group, and the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. So there we are. Without further ado, it gives me great delight to introduce the first of our three distinguished speakers, and she is Victoria Phillips, who's Head of Employment Rights at Thompsons Solicitors, focusing on Thompsons trade union clients and ensuring the team of employment lawyers there is responsive to their needs. She writes articles on employment law matters for Thompson's own publications, including Labour and European Law Review, as well as external publications. Victoria is a previous national president of the National Union of Students and also was the Labour Party National Women's Officer from 1989 to 1993. And Victoria qualified as a solicitor at Thompson's Solicitors in 1996. So over to you, Victoria. You're on mute.
Right, lovely. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be with you. Sorry, as always, slightly overcommitted myself today. So I hope to be with you as long as 1:30, but I really have to leave then. It's a great day to be talking to such an august body as well, of those interested in labour law, because the Supreme Court this morning handed down the historic decision in the case of Coastal and Dunkley, which was a case involving Unite members, where I'm sure Tony is well aware of the case, which was an attempt by the employer to undermine existing collective bargaining arrangements. It's a bit of a follow-up to the Wilson and Palmer case, where direct offers were put to the employees, which were, and we used the post Wilson and Palmer legislation to ensure that compensation was granted. That's been appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court this morning have handed down their decision that the employer couldn't undermine collective bargaining arrangements in that way. Huge victory for Unite, huge victory for trade unions, and I'm very, very proud of my colleagues at Thompsons who've worked with Unite and the barristers team to secure that victory. So it's in terms of your discussion today, I hope it's useful to just say a little bit about that. What I intended to focus on this morning was the dilemma I think there currently is about enforcement of individual employment rights. I should preface my remarks by saying this is entirely in a personal capacity, although I act for a number of trade unions. Nothing in what I say is policy either of Thompsons or those unions. It's purely personal, my personal view. But I do think the pandemic has really highlighted the difficulty workers face in enforcing their rights. And I think that changing patterns of work, particularly with more remotely based workers, are also going to impact on the ability of workers to know about their rights and then enforce them. If they haven't got their trade union rep just around down the corridor or making a cup of coffee at the same time as them and saying, you shouldn't stand for that, how does an individual worker know that they're being inappropriately treated or that there is something they can do in order to exercise their rights? Because you're a group of historians, I'm going to start with what is, I'm sure, a very superficial reference to the Donovan Report. And I think it's important to recognise, well, my perspective is that the Donovan Report was, in any event, was a historic fudge designed to stop trade unions striking over employers losing their jobs, and to put in place as a SOP a system of individual rights enforcement, and very much about undermining collective rights. And when the right to claim these individual rights, which were very narrowly drawn in 1971, we're talking redundancy, we're talking about unfair dismissal and wages, and some very limited health and safety rights. The system of industrial tribunals wasn't bad at enforcing those rights. There was quite a restricted time limit in which a case had to be brought. They were heard very quickly. Cases would routinely be listed for no longer than half a day. The industrial tribunal chairman used to knock through the cases very swiftly. Reinstatement was a realistic remedy because the individual had only been out of the workplace for a limited period of time, and although appeals were available, they weren't very often exercised, and everyone just accepted the outcome generally. But cases were heard really quite quickly, and the justice may have been a little rough, but rights were enforced. What you then have is, in the 70s and 80s, the introduction of new jurisdictions, sex discrimination, race discrimination, and equal pay. So the burden on the tribunal becomes a little more. Perhaps the proceedings become a little bit more legalistic. Certainly when I qualified in, I've now forgotten, 1996, there was very rarely cases where lawyers were involved. Sometimes, but generally it would be a trade union rep on the employee side or the individual acting for themselves, and an HR representative on the other side. But already in 1996, people were complaining about, trade union reps would complain to me about the process becoming far too legalistic and citation of case law and, a lot longer decisions. So already the system was beginning to creak in 96. And then, of course, in the late 90s, in the Labour administration, you have a positive explosion of individual rights, frankly. Disability discrimination came in 95, just before the Labour government. But after the Labour government, we had working time regulations, national minimum wage, part-time work, age discrimination, sexual orientation. I'm bound to have missed something, religion and belief. And all those rights, again, have to be enforced by that framework of individual rights as a result of lobbying from the industrial tribunal chairs. They got changed into being employment tribunal judges. And although there is a state-enforced regime in terms of national minimum wage, name and shame by HMRC, we all know how really underfunded that process is. And in reality, most individual rights claims for either non-payment of national minimum wage or holiday pay, a very big example, have to be brought as individual claims and through the employment tribunal process. By coming forward in time, by 2013, when the Tory government, coalition government, introduced the employment tribunal fees, the system was really struggling and was creaking at the seams in the employment tribunal service. Cases had got longer. My archetypal half-day unfair dismissal case was at least 2 days. Discrimination cases are listed for eye-boggling numbers of days. 10 days and upwards are completely routine. We know, and our trade union colleagues are very conscious of the fact that the mass equal pay claims that were brought just before single status in 97 and in the 10 years subsequent to that take years, and the employers argue the toss about every particular legal point, will pursue the case on appeal to the highest courts they can get it into. Partly, I mean, this sounds very cynical on my part, but if they win one of these appeals, of course, the amount of money they pay in legal fees are as nothing compared with the amount of compensation they would otherwise have to pay the mainly women who'd been underpaid for, you know, the last 6 years that they could claim for. So the system was creaking at the point fees were introduced. But what then happened was that when cases started to fall once fees were introduced, and they fell really very dramatically, save for cases that were supported by trade unions. I mean, I was pulled aside at an employment lawyers event by some respondent firm of solicitors who said, thank God for Thompsons and trade union lawyers, because otherwise we wouldn't have any work. I mean, it was literally at that stage as far as they were concerned. But from 2013, the employment tribunals were really starved of resources. Judges weren't replaced. I'm sure some of you may be wing members will know that wing members who retired weren't replaced. There was no recruitment round for new wing members, and no recruitment round for new judges. The administration was merged with all other bits of civil justice administration. I'm not saying I'm against that, but as long as it's properly resourced, it could work if it was properly resourced, but it frankly wasn't. And then, of course, thanks to the efforts of Unison, and Christina's now left, I think, but, you know, of overturning, and again going all the way to the Supreme Court and overturning the fees in 2017, the tribunals were in a really, really poor state. The other thing that had happened during the period of fees is, because law of unintended consequences, respondents' lawyers didn't have enough cases to justify their fees, so they made them last longer, you know, and there was a little bit of that happening with tribunals as well, I think. You know, they needed to justify their existence. They couldn't actually have weeks where cases weren't being heard. So the 2-day unfair dismissal case turned into a 4-day unfair dismissal case. This is slightly anecdotal on my part, but, you know, bearing in mind Thompsons does deal with many thousands of tribunal claims in a year, it's not entirely so. And the other factor that happened during fees, and again this is unintended consequences, is that, you know, if you're a respondent, why would you settle a case which is earning you money? I mean, there's no cost regime in the employment tribunal, so in employment tribunal system, you can't get your costs back, win or lose. The respondents' lawyers know that the employer is going to have to pay them whatever. So there's no incentive to settle cases, and their cases became dragged out and settled very, very late in the day, if at all. So the pandemic, coming full up to date, has made the position far, far worse. When I originally gave a version of this, was thinking these thoughts and gave a version of this talk, cases were being listed into 2023. So that's a year and a half. A year and a half away. I yesterday heard of a case that was listed for 2024. So that's 2.5 years to wait to have a case heard. Okay, it's a long case. It's a discrimination case, but even so, that isn't a way of getting quick justice, a quick remedy for either the employee who's being discriminated against or dismissed, or the employer who's facing the claim of discrimination or harassment or unfair dismissal. I mean, it's just not in the interest of justice for matters to be dragged out that long. I'm conscious in saying this that the situation is absolutely terrible in the criminal justice system, and I'm not seeking to, I wouldn't wish the criminal justice system to be, I'm not trying to put the employment system above that. I just think there needs to be a debate about whether or not any individual gets justice when they have to wait that long, whether it's enforcement of their civil rights through employment tribunals or their criminal, their right not to any criminal responsibility, both for victims and defendants. There's also huge administrative chaos. And my fee, there have been some good things that have come out of the Employment Tribunal's pandemic response. We're using online facilities for what's called cloud video platform for many employment tribunal cases now, and that's cracking through the backlog. And in fact, it does seem to me that there's part of that system that would be worth retaining into the future, certainly when there's a case where facts aren't hugely in dispute, wages haven't been paid, holiday hasn't been paid. Often those cases are not defended by the employer anyway. For a relatively swift hearing in public, but online to be heard, stops the individual who's probably maybe lost 300 quid or something, but which is a lot of money to them. But if they then have to pay to come into central London to have the case heard, hang around for ages while it comes on, all the upset that is entailed, compared with, as long as they've got an IT connection, being able to sit in their back room or their bedroom and actually deal with the case speedily, that seems to me that's a good thing, and we should try and maintain that in order to maintain access to justice. Not sure online hearings really work very well for the more complicated cases, but I think there should be some element of online hearing that continues into the future. But I think all of this highlights that we desperately need a new mechanism of enforcing individual employment rights, and putting all the onus on the individual to enforce their rights is quite unrealistic. So the employment green paper that was published recently at Labour Party conference by Andy MacDonald and others did call for a statutory enforcement body, and I think that's a really important step ahead, as long as obviously it's adequately resourced, and I mean certainly really appropriate for enforcing not only national minimum wage and holiday pay, but also equal pay. That seems to me that's a classic example of where some of the issues that Christina was talking about in terms of women's employment could be resolved by a statutory enforcement body that had that as part of their responsibility. I mean, we see it at the moment, huge amounts of litigation going on about issues like sleep-ins, travel times between jobs, and despite the valiant efforts of trade unions to let people know about what their rights are, we still know that lots of care workers, domestic care workers, are not paid for their travel time between jobs. We know that lots of workers who are sleeping in aren't paid the appropriate national minimum wage rate for the times that they are working. So it feels to me like it's the right time to have a wider debate about how individual rights are enforced and what role trade unions can play in that debate and in trying to change our attitudes, because always bearing in mind my first point, you know, the individual rights regime was used as a way of undermining trade union collectivism. So those were my contributions. I hope I haven't run over too long, Sarah, because you will tell me off if I have. I hope.
I certainly would, but I don't need to. Thank you very much indeed, Victoria, for that very eloquent contribution on the importance of individual employment rights and reminding us of their origin, and also the horrifyingly creaky employment tribunal system, and your very important comments at the end about the need for some other means of dealing with what are effectively collective cases on issues like equal pay. And I'm reminded of the old saying, justice delayed is justice denied. And for those individuals who are waiting year after year to have their cases resolved, I mean, it's just completely unacceptable. Anyway, thank you for that. And let's move on now to our next speaker, who is Janet Williamson, who's a senior policy officer in the TUC's Economic and Social Affairs Department, responsible for policy on corporate governance, institutional investment, executive pay, and corporate social responsibility. And as if that wasn't enough, Janet's also the chair of Trade Union Share Owners, which is an initiative that brings together union funds to collaborate on voting and engagement at company AGMs. And she's also a trustee of the TUC Superannuation Society, in which I have to confess I have more than a slight interest. She contributes to TUC pensions policy and campaigning, as well as having a wider economic brief across the labour market. So over to you, Janet. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Sarah. And yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's been a really fascinating discussion so far. I've really enjoyed it. So I've been asked to kind of set out the TUC's priorities for, how to create a fairer economy after the pandemic. So that's what I'll do. And just stop me if I've got kind of lots of different points. So do just stop me if, if I'm running over time. So, well, the pandemic is not, of course, over, but 20 months or so in, it does seem fairly safe to say that we won't go back to exactly the way we were before, but what changes we make and how they land is, I think, still very much up for grabs. I think there is a huge appetite across much of the country and certainly across the labour market to build back better after the crisis. But I completely agree with David and others saying this earlier, that this can't be taken for granted, and it's absolutely, I think, something we will have to fight for. So it has already been referred to. The government, I think, has tried to kind of seize the initiative on building back better, certainly with that slogan. Key to that now, I think, this year, as opposed to last year perhaps, is its levelling up agenda. And again, it's a very clever slogan. Who can disagree with the idea that poorer communities should be raised to the level of wealthier ones? But I mean, again, slogans don't translate neatly into policy. And we think that we need a very, an open and transparent debate about what levelling up means in practice, how success will be measured, and how levelling up can most effectively be brought about. So the key message from the union movement on this agenda is that you can't level up the country without levelling up at work. We've just published a report that basically sets out why this is the case, quite a lot of analysis, and also our key proposals for levelling up at work, and that's what I'll focus on today. So don't really need to say this to this audience, but I think the starting point for this is that work is absolutely central to everyone's quality of life. And this starts with a kind of strong link between work and income, which of course continues into retirement, as Sarah has just referred to, for those with access to an occupational pension scheme. But it also goes way beyond that. And the quality of our work, in particular, the control or lack thereof that we have over our working lives, has a major impact on our health. And the government has been right to highlight tackling postcode disparities in health as an important aim of levelling up. But these in part reflect stark occupational differences in health outcomes. So 1 in 3 low paid workers who left their jobs before state pension age did so because of ill health. By contrast, just 1 in 20 professionals who left the labour market early did so because of long-term sickness. So if we leave millions of people in low paid, insecure work, significant economic and social disparities in health outcomes and life expectancy will remain in place. And fundamentally, for far too many people, the link between work, security and opportunity is completely broken. Over half of those living in poverty are in working households, and this rises to a shocking 3/4 of children living in poverty are in working households. So too many people now find that their work is trapping them in poverty rather than providing a route out. And crucially for the levelling up agenda and the way that's being kind of framed by the government is that this is very much a national rather than a regional or localised problem. So low pay and insecurity are not neatly concentrated by geography, rather they're prevalent across every region and nation. So over 1 in 7 jobs in every region and nation of the UK is paid less than the real living wage. This reflects the fact that low-paying sectors are large employers across all regions and nations. So, retail and social care, we've already heard quite a lot, absolutely rightly, about social care this morning. But they're, they're among the top sectors of employment in every region and nation. And strategies that ignore these and other low-paid sectors simply can't deliver a levelling up agenda. Like low pay, insecure work is also endemic across the whole of the UK. Only Yorkshire and Humberside and Scotland have got less than 1 in 10 workers, so 10% in insecure work. And the distribution of insecure work and low pay both reflects, but also, deepens existing inequalities. The Black and minority ethnic workers are more likely to be in insecure work than white workers, while women are more likely to be low paid than men. Again, we heard quite a bit about this already. And disabled workers face significant employment and pay gaps compared with non-disabled workers. And clearly these differences reflect discrimination, but they also reinforce it and create further barriers to change. So to build back better and to level up the UK, we need to address the challenge of poor quality work head on. A lot of industrial policy and regional policy to date has, basically sort of aimed to redistribute better paid jobs more evenly across the country. And, achieving a better distribution of high skilled, high paid jobs around the country is an important part of what is needed to level up. But if it's not linked to strategies to improve the experience and rewards of low paid work, then poverty and insecurity will remain endemic across the country. So as well as creating new good quality, green jobs, very important, but we also need to level up the jobs that people are already in. I think, the experience of London shows that the creation and sort of existence of high paid jobs in an area does not automatically lead to rising incomes and quality of life for the wider community. And, indeed, unless low pay and poverty are also addressed, there's a danger that the creation or the existence of higher paid jobs will lead to deepening inequality, unaffordable housing, and being priced out of local amenities for many local people. London has the highest rate of work poverty in the country, with 22% of people in poverty in a working household. So, the creation of good quality green jobs is desperately needed, but it's not enough on its own. So I'm just going to turn now to the TUC's priorities for levelling up at work. And as I say, just do stop me if I'm going over time. So there's kind of 4 broad areas that I want to sort of talk about. And firstly, and most fundamentally, is kind of ensuring that decent work is kind of hardwired into economic growth, kind of redistribution a bit, to use a term that was somewhat discredited when it was first used. Secondly, government leading by example, so its role as an employer and also in sort of procurement. Thirdly, strengthening the floor of employment protection for all workers, employment rights, and finally, strengthening our safety net, beyond the workplace. So I think firstly and most fundamentally, we need to change the way our economy works so that economic growth translates more naturally into, good quality jobs and work. And for that, we need an institutional environment and sort of, economic incentives, if you like, that encourage the development of business models which are based on high wage, high skilled and secure jobs, rather than what we have at the moment, which is a huge reliance on low paid and insecure work. And for that, reform of our skills framework, corporate governance and industrial policies and collective bargaining are all, vital to kind of bring about that change. So firstly, skills. We've heard quite a lot about this already from Toby, but I mean, we, like, the Labour Party, are calling for a new national lifelong learning and skills strategy based on a vision of a high skill economy where workers can gain both transferable skills, but also specialist skills to, build their job prospects. I'll be a bit quick because we've heard about it already, but there's basically 4 elements that we're calling for: a significant boost to investment in training and skills, both by the state, but also by employers. Fully agree with what's been said about people having access to kind of, fully funded learning and skills entitlements throughout their whole lives, and expanding opportunities for upskilling and retraining, which does sound very obvious, but as has already been said, is very far from the case at the moment. We're calling for everyone to have a lifelong learning accounts and a new right to paid time off for training, And crucially for us, we think this should be delivered by a national skills task force that would bring together employers, unions and other key stakeholders, along with government, to sort of deliver a really joined up skills agenda. So moving on rapidly, we need corporate governance reform as well. Our current corporate governance system really puts the interests of shareholders above other stakeholders, and arguably above the long-term interest of the company itself. And that this encourages company directors to prioritize shareholder returns over wages and over long-term investment, which then fuel short-termism and poor employment practices. So we need to address excuse me, shareholder primacy, both through the reform of directors' duties and also promoting workforce voice in corporate governance. We think that the inclusion of worker directors on company boards would bring people with a very different range of experiences into the boardroom, which would help to challenge groupthink and change the culture and the priorities of the boardroom, and improve the quality of board decision making. And indeed, where we do have worker directors in place, that is very much seen to be the case. So we're calling for 2 changes to employment law. Firstly, on directors' duties, to reform them to take away the current priority of shareholder interests, and secondly, to require that worker directors should comprise 1/3 of the board at all companies with more than 250 staff. Thirdly, well, I mean, as this audience is clearly very well aware, giving workers stronger rights to organise collectively in unions is absolutely key to raising pay and working conditions, and just more broadly giving workers more say over their working lives. And we know there's lots and lots of evidence, which I won't go into here, that collective bargaining promotes higher pay, better training, safer and more flexible workplaces, and greater equality. And indeed, I think the absence of a collective approach has very much contributed to the poor paying conditions, which is now resulting in labour shortages over the country. So we need to give workers stronger rights to speak with one voice and bargain with their employer. And part of that is giving unions access to workplaces, to tell workers about the benefits of union membership following the New Zealand model. I wanted to go into this in detail now, but we did produce a report setting out our detailed proposals on collective bargaining back in 2019, which I can put a link to that in the chat. But we also do believe that we need to develop mechanisms for bargaining between unions and employers across sectors, which Christina referred to briefly earlier. And we think that should start in sectors which are characterised by low pay and poor conditions, such as social care, and also other sectors like hospitality. Finally, in this part of reshaping the economy, we need sort of industrial and trade policies to promote good jobs. So I'll be very brief, but just kind of put simply, we need to use trade and procurement policies to strengthen local supply chains and raise employment standards, including kind of using local content requirements where they are legal, which sometimes they're not, and a completely new approach to trade to kind of lock in ILO standards into trade agreements, into WTO rules, not treating them as non-tariff barriers to be removed, as is quite often the case. I'm not quite sure how I'm doing on time. The second area that where we wanted to see action is basically what the government can do as an actor in its own right, and we believe that the government should really be leading by example in levelling up, by showcasing good quality employment practices itself, but also making decent work a requirement of all government funding, so that the power of government and government spending is then being used to drive up employment standards. So a big part of that is undoing the damage inflicted by austerity and years of cuts on public services over the last decade, and putting in place a kind of fully funded plan backed by sustainable investment and delivered by public sector workers who are properly rewarded and also directly employed. Kind of aware of speaking at almost the same time as the Chancellor. So I mean, it's good to hear that the public sector pay freeze is ending, but we need more than that. We need pay rises to keep pace with cost of living going forward, but also crucially to make up for lost earnings over the last decade. It was really shocking hearing those comparisons that Christina was giving earlier about, you know, the wages of care workers and so on, how they've diminished relatively over the last decade or so. And also, you know, a big point of importance for the union is that public ownership and in-house provision should be the default for public service provision, and that public sector workers must be directly employed. Excuse me. We also, though, need procurement and investment standards to support decent work. And we are saying that decisions on infrastructure spending, including through the National Infrastructure Strategy, should be subject to a job creation, but also a job quality test that evaluates the quality and quantity of jobs according to an agreed set of measures. Just going to take some water. So we both need to reform the economy so that economic growth translates naturally into decent work, and we need the government to kind of, you know, lead by example in employment and in procurement practices. But I think those won't be enough on their own, and we will still, to tackle low pay and insecurity, need to strengthen the you know, the kind of floor of employment protection for all workers, you know, make the worst forms of exploitation illegal, raise the wages of the lowest paid, and also tackle, you know, structural discrimination in the workplace. So a few key priorities for us on that agenda: we need to ban 0 hours contracts by giving workers the right to a shift that reflects their normal hours of work, combined with, you know, strong rules on notice of shifts and compensation for cancelled shifts. And we want us to see an immediate raise in the level of the minimum wage to put more money into workers' pockets and address in-work poverty. Well, a lot of that's been leaked already, of course. We'd also like to see the government strengthening pay gap reporting, or strengthening gender pay gap reporting, but introducing, you know, ethnic and disability pay gap reporting, and strengthening what's already in place, so to require employers to publish action plans on what they're doing to close the pay gaps that they reported. And we also would like to see the government complying with what is already a kind of a duty, the public sector equality duty, but actually putting it into practice and kind of, you know, proactively considering equality impacts at each stage of policy making with a view to promoting equality, rather than doing this kind of retrospectively and when they're challenged on things and then not really addressing anything. So finally, since no one has stopped me,
I will stop you in a second, but do a finally.
The absolute finally is kind of beyond the workplace. You know, for all of us, there are times that we can't work, our older age, you know, ill health, when we can't find suitable work, you know, bringing up children, all important task. And of course, people need economic security through every part of their lives. So we also want to see a strong, you know, social safety net. We are calling for the increases in the state pension age to be shelved and the triple lock to be maintained. Absolutely, you know, we've been campaigning very, very hard for the £20 uplift to community credit. We were campaigning for it to be kept in place, and we now would like that cut to be reversed. So I'll just sort of wrap up. I mean, basically, the key argument I suppose we're trying to make is that poor quality work is a, you know, major driver of inequality across the country, you know, in every region and nation, every part of the UK, including those that are seen as the particular target for levelling up. And, you know, we support other strategies, infrastructure projects, transport is vital, you know, community wealth building, they all got an important role to play. But, you know, unless we kind of manage to reduce the numbers of people in jobs that are low paid and insecure and, you know, basically don't offer a route to better quality work, then little will change ultimately in the lived experiences of a significant number of proportion of people across every part of the country. So we can't level up the country without levelling up at work. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Janet, for a very interesting contribution, absolutely packed with information and covering hugely important issues like the quality of work and the rapidly escalating cost of living. And it's always good to hear the TUC's priorities. So thank you for that. And our final, last but not least guest is Neil Carberry, who I haven't seen for a long time, but remember with affection and respect. Hello, Neil.
Hello, Sarah. Good to see you.
Hi. Neil was appointed Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation in June 2018, having before that been Managing Director at the CBI, leading their work on the labour market, skills, energy and infrastructure. Neil is a Chartered Fellow of the CIPD, a member of the Council of ACAS, and a former member of the Low Pay Commission. And even more interestingly, Neil is also an RFU qualified rugby coach and is one of the 8,000 co-owners who made Heart of Midlothian the UK's biggest fan-owned football club. So there you are. Fabulous introduction. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I'm a fan of the long commute being on a Saturday to the West End of Edinburgh. It is I, the ambassador from the Forces of Capital. And I thought what I might say in this amongst friends, and for my part, I'm a friend of the trade union movement, is a little bit about what it feels like to be running a business in Britain right now. And I'll touch on some of the themes that colleagues have already spoken about. The most common question in the British business community right now when it comes to policy is, what the hell exactly is the plan here? And I think particularly to do with the workforce, which has been left in a limbo a bit longer than everything else, because even if you think back to the Greg Clark industrial strategy, the Greg Clark industrial strategy's people section had a lot to say about skills, which was mostly things the government was going to do anyway, and very little to say about the workforce more broadly. So I suppose my theme here is a little bit about how do businesses, trade unions and other people of good conscience in this environment start to get some pragmatism and practicality back into government thinking about policy as regards the labour market, because I think the thing that unites us all is the interest in the prosperity of the United Kingdom. We can have arguments about the policies that achieve that best, but the goal is to make life better for people who live in the UK, fundamentally. And the most powerful example of the disconnect that has come to mind recently came about. I saw Kevin Rowan for dinner. Some of you will know from the TUC the other week, and Kevin and I were discussing an incident that happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago when we were in a room with the Secretary of State for Education when the National Retraining Scheme was a thing before it got merged into something else. I lose track of how things get rolled into different things, and we had a discussion. This would be about 2016 or 2017, and the Secretary of State said, well, what sort of things do we think we want people retraining towards? And I said, HGV driving. And the Secretary of State said, oh, no, that's fine. We've got self-driving trucks coming. That'll be fine. We don't want to be retraining people towards that. And there's your disconnect, I think, between the practicalities and the pragmatism that trade unions and businesses deal with every day, and some of the debate that goes on around our policy at the moment. So if you're a business, I think we all had a reasonably good idea a few weeks ago in Manchester of what it felt like to be a union general secretary in the 1980s, because business was pretty heftily the bad guy for most of the Tory party conference. And I have to, my summation would be that business relations with government are open and at official level working relatively well. But where we are not is in a space where the Conservative Party is in any way, shape or form, in inverted commas, the party of business as we would understand it. And the business voices that this government hears come from certain spaces. Property, certainly. The investor community as well, particularly private equity. And to a certain extent, small businesses whose owners happen to be politically conservatives and are members of local conservative associations. What there is not, if you go back into the 50s or 60s or the 70s, in the days when you could basically regard Labour as the party of the trade unions and the Conservatives as the party of business, around a major FTSE 250 board table, you probably had someone who was a member of the Conservative Party. That really isn't true now. Business is a much more apolitical space, and some of the voices that are heard and some of the places that this government's policies come from are slightly different to what we've known before. So as businesses, there's a bit of a disconnect in our understanding of where government is and what they're trying to achieve in the workforce and in the workplace. We can see some pretty pointed and swift interventions. The national living wage rise the other day is a classic example of that, although how many times you can spin the low pay commission doing its work as a major political decision is kind of, yeah, it sticks in the craw of I suspect more than one of the former commissioners who are on this call. But there's a piece here about government doing some things very interventionist and then having no other pace, leaving everything else. And that I think is a real challenge in an environment where businesses are struggling with some tough stuff. And I'll give you an example. Hybrid working. Hybrid working is teaching British businesses pretty quickly the difference between individual and collective employment relations. Because if you've brought your HR team up in the cult-like school of HRM, and those of you who know me know I have next to zero time for that way of thinking about people. I'm an employee relations guy and always will be. There are too few of us left on the business side of the table. Then you don't know how to deal with an issue where the difference of opinion isn't actually between you and the staff, but between members of the staff. So, classic example, you've got an experienced person who's perfectly productive at home, but part of their job is to be in the workplace and help with the development of others. How do you resolve that? So there's a whole slew of new and different challenges the pandemic has thrown up. And government and businesses are struggling with those. And at the moment, government, looks more like a hindrance than a help. If you think about the fact that that, for instance, on skills, they are obsessed with thinking that the business's problem with the apprenticeship levy is that it's a levy. It's not. We pay 5 times that much if the system worked. The problem is they take away our money and then they give it back to us for stuff that looks good. And if you want to level up, I think your apprenticeship system should be increasing year on year the number of young people who are doing apprenticeships and not cutting it, which is what this system is doing. So, and that's just an example of where we need greater stewardship in our policy discussion. We can approach this from different positions, but the truth of the matter is that too much of what we are seeing in workplace policy is about the headline and not about the practicality. And it is actually the role of trade unions and of businesses to step up into that gap, but it's also the role of government to engage with that discussion as well. And this is not some kind of great beer and sandwiches return to the 1960s or 1970s, because we have models that work in the UK to do this. I've mentioned the Low Pay Commission. The ACAS Council is another good example of this, because one of the challenges here is how do we make sure that we're not just doing things that are about compliance? Because businesses can comply and they can choose low road compliance. So going to Janet's point, earlier this year we had changes to IR35, which affects many of the freelancers that my members of the REC place in different roles. There was no movement in a 2-year delay, despite heavy campaigning from us, and I know from the TUC, for substantial regulation of umbrella companies, which are critical to how freelancers are paid. So guess what? The guys who are skirting the rules are doing okay right now. They have fewer costs to carry than the ones who are trying to do it the right way. And this integrated approach you need to pick up. I've seen it on low pay commission visits. I became obsessed over the course of 7 years on the commission with the Glasgow restaurant sector. And I've watched the number of tables that waiting staff in Glasgow restaurants have to cover. And if people abscond without paying, lose that money from their wages often. Increase as the minimum wage has increased. The point about 0 hours contracts, I think, is another one. But businesses have a number of ways of adapting to intervention aimed at improving the quality of workplace life. Policies to work have to work practically on the ground. You need to do more than just pass a law. So you'd expect me to be skeptical as a business representative, thinking the law could solve all our problems. I don't think actually the business community is viscerally against much in the way of new legislation. I think for instance, the CBI is taking a very progressive position on things like worker directors that Janet was talking about. But for us as a business community, a lot more focus on ER as an approach, and less on HRM. A lot more focused on building networks in places. So I've been heavily involved in the professional and business services. I forget if it's a commission or a committee, but the sector group for professional business services work on place. And my standard joke is the longer I spend looking at the British labour market, the more obsessed I become with buses. But there's something about how do we build networks in place, and it's not the Heseltine thing of getting the chambers of commerce to do it. It's actually a bit more nuanced and socially focused than that. What's the role of my trade union in the company where I'm working, talking to the trade union guys of the company down the road? Skills is a classic example. I remember years ago having a discussion with a business in Stoke. They were working with the biggest training provider in the area for what they do, and they were seeing, and they said to me, look, the training provider I work with has 5 clients in this area. There are 45 companies in this area that do this. What are the other 40 doing? I think pressure of place matters in terms of changing things, in terms of workplace experience, as well as the pressure of sector. I struggle a bit with sector because sector definitions are more difficult now once you get beyond the obvious ones like care. And I think for the trade union movement, part of this is how do we make sure that we're always focused on people's daily working lives. I slightly get the hives. I'm going to allow myself one really challenging comment to the movement. I slightly get the hives when we talk about the number of hundreds of thousands of people who are in secure work, because my members placed 1 million people on an average day as temporary workers into workplaces. And I'm sure in there is some poor practice. But I resist wholeheartedly the idea of chucking all the whole million into some kind of put upon bucket. The same goes with kind of our discussion about casual work. Yes, I can understand where the campaigning phrase around banning 0 hours contracts comes from. Equally, I remember sitting with a union general secretary over dinner once and him saying to me that he found the whole thing ironic because he spent most of his career trying to get people onto 0 hours contracts because they were better than the casual arrangements that they had before. So I think that real ask for the business community to the trade union community is probably about practicality and help the good guys be successful, because I think dissemination of what good practice is really matters, and I'm not sure government could do it as well as we can. Now, within all of that, yes, absolutely, we need to address employment tribunals. They're an absolute mess. We absolutely do need a proper enforcement body set up. But actually, the most important thing I think government could do is just accept that part of its role is to steward the labour market, not just to regulate it. And that does mean actively engaging with businesses and their representatives and workers and their representatives at local and national levels across the UK to talk about what will work on the ground. And I think every kind of business that is a member of the REC, chief execs I talk to from my life at the CBI, there are institutional failures on the business side, just like there are institutional failures everywhere. There are failures to look at things that have been in place for 20 years that need to be addressed, and they've just been overlooked or not questioned in the right way. But the way we do that is we steward this whole thing and we start to have more intelligent discussions about how we can make a difference. And I think there is a mood in the business community for that. I know that there is space for that in the trade union community. What I'd really like to see from government is them setting their policy and regulatory actions on the labour market into the framework of a genuine economic plan that makes a difference. I think businesses are where many trade unions would be, which is the only way that we can address the public finances, is to grow our way out of it. I don't think there is scope for cuts. And then we go from there. But Sarah, I'm aware it's the top of the hour, so I'll draw stumps there.
That's perfect. Thank you very much indeed, Neil. And I think everyone here would completely understand the point you're making and completely support the point you're making about the complete disconnect now between policy making and reality on the ground as far as the government goes. I love the comments about the Tory party cross-dressing at their conference, and definitely the need for unions and employers to work together to try and develop a kind of strategy that perhaps the government would start taking some notice of. But I remain deeply cynical myself at the moment. But nonetheless, let's see whether other colleagues want to contribute. I can see Tom Wilson's hand first of all. Tom.
Thanks very much indeed, Sarah and Neil. I've just finished reading Jim Mower's fantastic biography of Sir Walter Citrine, which I heartily recommend to anybody who's not yet come across it. But one of the things Citrine did in the early 30s was to revive or set up the Trade Union Labour Party Council of Labour, I think it was called. Jim will correct me if I got the term wrong. And listening to what you were saying, Neil, about relationships between certainly big responsible employers and unions and government, I just wonder whether now, post-pandemic, in this time of not wartime, as David Edgerton has rightly said, that's the wrong analogy completely, but a time of national crisis, we need some new institutions. Firstly, perhaps a revived version of the Labour Party Trade Union Liaison Committee of some kind, which of course would include the non-affiliated unions as well as the affiliated ones. And currently the non-affiliates are more than half and feel very excluded, I think, from a lot of the discussions that Labour has with unions. But also, should there be some sort of institutional setting to pull, you know, the better employers, if you like, your members, I'm sure most of them, as you say, are very responsible people, and unions together in some institutional framework. We should encourage the kind of stewarding of the economy and the stewarding of a completely new approach, rather than this adversarial, not very well informed debate that leads to complete lack of any real planning.
I will bring all the speakers back in. Let's just take a couple more contributions first. So I saw Tony's hand. Tony Burke.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. And I thought all the contributions today from our speakers have been excellent. Get a lot of food for thought. And certainly the last points that Neil has raised are very important as well in regard to an employer's point of view. But one thing today that I just wanted to say, Sarah, that we shouldn't miss is in the post-pandemic world, there's another key issue. It's not just relations between employees and different working patterns and what's going to happen. It's the whole question now that we're picking up, and I'm the president of the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions, which we're revitalizing, and that is the question of working time. I think the pandemic has shown a very clear lead in many respects that people are looking for alternatives, whether that's hybrid working or flexible working. And we in the CSEU have got this campaign going. There are some differences of opinion with other organisations who continue to refer to a 4-day week when we already have members who work 3 days and go nuts if you say to them that they're going to work 4 days. But the whole question about working time has got to be addressed. And it's got to be addressed in the way that we're proposing from the CSEU, and that is through agreements with companies, and that involves improved productivity as well. So there are many, many issues. I'd be interested to see what Neil's view and our other speakers' view of this is, that we can't escape it. There's got to be something done. And if we're just going to go back to what we had before the pandemic, I don't think that's going to be acceptable to people. I think sloganizing and saying, ask your boss for a 4-day week isn't going to work. And that's why the CSEU is working with Strathclyde to start preparing our strategy so that we can get into discussions with employers with whom we have agreements on this. And I just wondered what other people thought, Sarah, about this question of working time and making a reduction in it whether that's shorter working week, longer holidays, different shift patterns, put all the lot into the mix, and knowing full well we've got to deal with this down at local level, because after all, it's the unions and shop stewards who will know how to do this. I've never known our members not to find a way not to go in work. They're very good at doing that if they can. And I just wondered what other people's view about that would be. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tony. While people perhaps are gathering their thoughts on that, shall I invite Neil just to come back in? A couple of the points from Tom and Tony were, I think, aimed at you, Neil, particularly, the business. Do you want to come back in on any of that?
Thank you, Sarah. So a couple of thoughts. I think on Tom's point with new institutions, I think probably, yes, we do need some new institutional frameworks. I mean, I'd start, frankly, going to, if you want to borrow the phrase about there's no levelling up without levelling up at work, well, I think we need to find a way to discuss work in government. The bit of the Corbyn manifesto I was softest on was a Department for Employment, because actually there isn't really a home in government for discussion about the labour market. There was under the last Labour government, there was a robust lead out of the Labour, out of what was the employment relations team at Bayes. These days, actually, the lead there is the Treasury, and I think, frankly, the Treasury are the last people you want leading on this stuff. So I think that I look at the reaction from the business side to the TUC proposals on some kind of National Recovery Commission. I mean, broadly, very, very warm. So I think it's about making sure that anything we do in that space is purposeful. But I think new institutions have some merit, so long as they're not just subscale talking shops. So one of the risks, I think the biggest challenge, going to the note that David put in the chat earlier, the biggest challenge is government willing to give away enough power to those new institutions to make them functional, and that might take time to establish. On Tony's point about working time, the thing that worries businesses most right now, outside of places where people can't places can't work outside the workplace, is having absolutely no control over working time whatsoever. And by control, I mean worry about burnout and worry about the elision of the gap, the bright line that traditionally has existed between work and not work. So there are prominent health and safety reasons, I think, to have a really robust discussion about our future thinking on working time. To Tony's point, I think it can. The ultimate decisions can only be made at enterprise level, but we have to kind of socialize a discussion about what is good on that, because I think the big challenge, putting the mirror up to us in the business community, I think the big challenge is actually not what we say and do at senior level, because companies are more like trade unions than we might care to admit. Usually when things go wrong, it's because someone in line management has a certain idea of how things should be, whatever the boardroom or HR think. So there's a big challenge in getting the working time piece sorted, is support for managers in terms of understanding what this new workplace is.
Thanks, Neil. I'll bring Victoria and Janet back in a second. Let's just take one from John Edmonds first. John?
Yeah, I'm muting. One of the interesting things that was going on during the pandemic, of course, particularly during the some of the lockdown periods, was that many employees were giving much greater flexibility. I mean, the most obvious thing was working at home or working in the office and so on, but there were changes in shift patterns. Things would change very quickly. And I think we need to draw.
Oops, John, you're oh, there you are.
Sorry, can you hear me?
We can now. We just lost you for a few seconds.
I think we need to draw the right conclusions from that. It's not that workers, by and large, want to change from one shift pattern to another, or from working at home to working in the office, or from working in the office to working at home. what was attractive to them was greater autonomy, a greater opportunity, working patterns to choose how they would work. And it seems to me that the trade union movement have got an opportunity here of catching the wind and to go for much greater mutuality in the way in which these decisions are made. And in many organizations and in many people, it's that which is of greater interest even than some of the substantive conditions that the trade unions spend a lot of time trying to improve.
Thanks, John. Janet, would you like to come back in on that and indeed on any of the other points raised?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. So yeah, just responding to the questions or the points made. All the points have been really, really good points. Completely agree with the need for kind of new institutions, new bodies, call it what you will, that would bring together unions and employers. I mean, this is one of our kind of standard things that we do tend to call for a lot. It runs through quite a lot of our policy. I mentioned the sort of national skills task force that we call for, we don't have. In fact, Neil referred to our calls for a kind of national recovery, council and so on and so forth. So that point is very well, is very well taken. I mean, the question that kind of came into my mind when you were saying it, Tom, was whether there's a little bit, maybe a bit, whether there's more that we could do to just sort of proactively get on with it a bit, rather than waiting for things to be set up. I mean, we have tried, we are sort of taking some steps towards that, is I think kind of as much as I can say really in sort of in social care, and trying, we're sort of taking steps towards talking to employers and also kind of commissioners about some kind of national framework for the workforce. I think can't put it more strongly than that really. And whether there's something on a more national scale working with the CBI that we could do. We have done a bit more like joint statements on things, I think, during the pandemic, and some of the calls around furlough and sort of not ending that and stuff were made jointly. So yeah, I think that agree with that point. And I think any ideas about what more the TUC can do to sort of concretize it, would be certainly interesting and useful, because I mean, in terms of calling for it, that is something that we do kind of on a regular basis. Yeah, very much agree with the point made by Tony about working time, and I think that kind of links to John's point as well to some extent as well. I mean, we have called, I think we did call it a 4 to 8 weeks, so we may have fallen foul of the point made around people who already work kind of 3 days, long hours over 3 days and so on and so forth. But anyway, we do call strongly for working hours to be reduced, and obviously that does mean tackling pay. We know people can't afford pay cuts at all, but equally we know that the way that work is organized and also how people are treated at work has a significant impact on motivation, sickness rates, and therefore output and productivity. So I agree with what you said, Tony, that the kind of those kind of cuts to working time need to be based on productivity increases. But I think sometimes when we talk, not we, but when particularly the government talks about productivity, it's all about investing in technology, and clearly that is important, and we have very low rates of investment in the UK. That should be changed, but it's also just about investing in people. Some of that's not even, is just around how you treat people, how work is organized. And I think that kind of does go sort of straight into John's point. People do want more autonomy and more say and more control. I mean, I think everyone here probably, or most people kind of agree that actually one of the ways of achieving that, and I think this comes to the point that Neil was making around sort of trade-offs between different perspectives between staff over what people want with flexible working, but is the best way of achieving that is around having a collective voice at work and sort of collective bargaining and being able to debate those things amongst staff, and then negotiate with the employer. And it's actually a very efficient way of managing trade-offs and different views, and putting schemes, putting plans into place. that that will bed in and achieve buy-in and so on and so forth. I think that's everything. I mean, just if I may, just a sort of quick response to Neil around the insecure work point, if I may. I mean, the number that we estimated insecure work is not 1 million; it's 3.6 million. So it's it's 11% of the work. It's a huge number of people. And actually, I mean, certainly 0 hours contracts have gone up a lot in recent years. And yes, it's a kind of punchy slogan, ban 0 hours contracts, but the by far the greater chunk of insecure work, by our estimate and calculation, is low paid self-employed workers. Much of which is bogus self-employment in our view. People are employed that way for basically, mainly tax advantages, but also some employment quote advantages, in other words, less employment rights and so on. And there, as I'm sure everyone here kind of is very aware of, there are sectors where self-employment is simply endemic as the way in which workers are, employed, if you can call it that, notably kind of construction. So, and we've also done kind of polling of workers that shows that a lot of people, the vast majority of people on 0 hours contracts are on them because there isn't another form of there's not another contract available to them. They're not really getting the kind of two-way flexibility, which is how those contracts are, presented. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Janet. And Victoria, did you want to comment on any of this or add anything in?
No, that's just a couple of thoughts. One is of which is, I think we were perhaps all of us surprised at the speed at which employers and employees managed to refocus and rearrange working hours and times during the pandemic. And that worked best where the trade union voice was being heard. And I particularly was struck about the voice of health and safety representatives who were perhaps more on it in terms of not the high level, this is how we have a safe workplace, but actually, those photocopiers are being touched all the time. That touch screen isn't probably very secure or safe, and actually suggesting really practical things that employers could do to make workplaces safe. Also in terms of trade unions, in terms of negotiating different patterns of work. And, when that happened, it happened well. Anecdotally, really, from our caseload, when it happened badly, it was completely disastrous. You have people being laid off or all sorts without consultation. So it was a bit of a scary time for employees. But I think the points that Tony makes are well made about negotiating changes in working time and working patterns and the essential role of trade unions in that. And it also exposes this fault line that we have currently got in terms of the individual right to ask to work flexibly. I know it's no more than that, it's a right to ask. But I think one of the difficulties employers often have dealing with that is the impact on the wider workplace. Whereas if those were treated as collective working organisation matters rather than individual rights, there might be far better outcomes. I mean, I have in mind, just because it's an industry I know quite a lot about, on the railways, traditionally those sort of, they call them accommodations, but different working patterns are routinely negotiated collectively, and those arrangements stick as a consequence. You don't have the disgruntled worker who says, oh, that's not fair, because they know it's gone through the same procedure. So it's more thoughts about, how to make these rights for workers meaningful. And I think the way to do that is making sure that the collective voice is very, very prominent, because particularly with hybrid working, particularly with remote dispersed working, the ability of the unscrupulous employer to take advantage of the goodwill of a keen employee is perhaps heightened. And I think the break is needed to make sure that it's proper for the business and also fair for the individuals.
Thank you, Victoria. Does anyone else want to contribute? Anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet want to make a comment? It can be general. It doesn't have to be specifically on this session. I can't see any more. Ah, Tom, go ahead.
Right. So I just wondered if I might press Janet slightly further, because one of the institutional questions I was raising was about we should reinstate some version of Citreen's Trade Union Labour Council of Labour, I think he called it, which would explicitly include the non-affiliated unions that currently don't sort of fit into the jigsaw terribly well at the moment. I don't know, Janet, that might be a bit difficult for you to respond to, but it'd be interesting to have your thoughts.
I asked Frances O'Grady that the other day at a seminar, and she was incredibly clever and diplomatic in her response. So I'm sure, Janet, you're going to be exactly the same now.
Thank you. I mean, I think the Labour Party, you know, does have discussions with a very wide range of unions, not just those that are affiliated. And you know, I mean, the TUC is not affiliated to the Labour Party, and you know, we have a lot of discussions ourselves with the Labour Party. So I don't, you know, clearly there's the kind of institutions which are specific and discussions which are specific to the Labour affiliated unions who are, you know, obviously paying the Labour Party and, you know, and have got kind of formal, you know, mechanisms in place. But I think, I certainly think that the dialogue between Labour and the unions goes kind of way beyond that, and is also not, you know, maybe it's also just important to know, it's not kind of restricted to what goes on at the national policy level as well. I mean, that's obviously kind of tends to be my focus with my role, but you know, actually kind of Labour Party and trade unionists are, you know, working together in communities, you know, in local parties, in CLPs. You know, there's a lot of interaction that goes on, you know, in other bodies as well. So there's a lot of kind of, I think the dialogue and the connection goes a lot further and is much more deep and sort of varied than kind of TULO and some of the official, if you like, bodies. But I think, you know, certainly agree dialogue, you know, is always kind of fruitful and useful, I think.
Thanks, Janet. And Philip has a question or a contribution, I think. Philip.
Well, I mean, it's following on from Tom, really. I mean, it's all very well saying in Walter Citreen's day, you know, we had this, but we are where we are. We seem to be in a very odd kind of situation in which past precedents often don't seem to be terribly useful. And going back to Neil's comments that, you know, the Tory party is no longer the party of business, which is really interesting. That almost and almost suggesting that business and the trade unions are kind of closer together in having a grip on the day-to-day reality than government is. But I mean, clearly there's a difference between the ruling party, the Conservative Party, and Whitehall. And I wonder, are there still sections of Whitehall that listen to the trade unions or business? Where are the access points now?
Does anyone care to have a stab at that one? I don't think I'm in a position to respond to it these days, but I don't want to keep picking on you, Janet. But
I think Neil wanted
go on,
to
have a go, Janet. Go on.
I'll have a go, and I think I saw that maybe Neil wanted to come in as well.
I'll take Neil after you, and then we'll start winding up.
Okay, thanks. I mean, we still do have you know, regular and frequent discussions with the government. I mean, a lot of it is with Bayes, and you know, changed its name so many times over the years. But you know, we also had quite a lot of interaction with the Treasury during the pandemic, particularly kind of over the furlough scheme. And I mean the furlough scheme is quite an interesting example because you know, the TUC was very involved in advocating for a, you know, we didn't call it that, we called it a short-time working scheme, and we would like some form of that to be made permanent. We should have mentioned that really, but my talk, but you know, that is something that we would like to see as a kind of permanent legacy of the pandemic. So you know, in some ways, the furlough scheme kind of does demonstrate the government will listen to us, you know, when they want to and not when they don't. And clearly, that decision was followed by the slashing of union loan, which was, you know, a very ideologically driven decision. But I guess, you know, we would argue we're better inside than outside. It's better to be sort of having those conversations and having that dialogue and kind of pushing those points. I think if that wasn't taking place, you would see a difference. I don't think it's I wouldn't characterize it as having no impact at all. But I think we are sort of, I'm anyway a bit left with this question, like when perhaps there are more opportunities for us to sort of link together with business and push jointly on things, and whether that wouldn't have more impact at times is certainly something worth kind of considering. Neil on that one.
Very good points. I remember in my days on the ACAS Council, which I notice Neil's on now, we were asked how we could ever prove what ACAS actually contributes. And it's very difficult because it was what ACAS stopped from happening that was really the major contribution that ACAS made, by vast amounts of very quiet, hard, effective work behind the scenes to, pull people together and stop crises developing. So it is tricky. I can see all that. And there's an awful lot going on behind the scenes, which isn't necessarily recognised. But Neil, I'm going to give you the last word. We do have to finish on the dot at 1:30. So if we could have a 2 or 3 minute burst from you, that would be a wonderful way to finish what's been a very good day, I think.
Just thinking about that. Just thinking about that ACAS point, Sarah, I was thinking about what Victoria was saying earlier about the delays in ETs, and of course I am really keen to get ETs operating much more efficiently and get a bit of and get up to pace on swifter justice, because the same principles apply on the respondent side actually, especially if you're a smaller employer, in terms of 2 years of distraction from your business can be absolutely hellish, especially in family businesses where it can tear families apart. But it needs to get better, not so quickly that it wrecks ACAS, because the pile of things waiting for the ET to take attention to post-conciliation at ACAS is really very large now. On the point about government influencing, look, I always think that trade union voice in government and business voice in government is better when it's yes but and not no. And of course there are some things where you have to say no, but if you can tack to the wind, you can usually have some good influence. And I think on practical issues, the big one we've had here, and it's very parochial but matters a lot to our members, is digital right to work checking, which is now extended into next April. It's hugely powerful for our rural economies, for instance. You don't want to have somebody driving around all over the county in somewhere like Devon checking people's right to work before they can start, when you could do it perfectly functionally online. And that kind of stuff, I think at an operational level is working fine. And the other end of the scale, I think it works fine as well. I mean, furlough is a great example of that. Ultimately, the final design of furlough came about, and certainly this is the story we were told on the business side, so I should wait and see whether trade union colleagues heard the same story, was when Francis and Carolyn sat with the Chancellor and just said, Chancellor, this isn't big enough. You need to go bigger. And it was listened to, because at the end of the day, they do not have the understanding of the practicalities of working life that trade unions and businesses do. My favourite example, the CBI talked to 20 times as many businesses in the week after the European referendum than Bayes did.
Well, that really does say it all.
With a much smaller resource. So at either end, at the crisis end and the practicality end, I think it's pretty good. I think the challenge comes where government has a policy that they are publicly committed to, they want to sound good, and there are practical difficulties that if it's got wrong, it won't politically sink them, but which are problematic in some way on the shop floor. And there I do think we lack the persuasive ability at the moment to say, just hold on, just let us give you a ladder to climb down on this, and let's work out how to do something better. And I think employment tribunals, actually, Sarah, going back to the work we did together over a decade ago now, have been in that place for a very long time now. And I think some of the frustrations we heard from Victoria have widely shared. It's never been a big enough problem for government. And to a certain extent, 5-6 years ago, the CBI, when I was effectively social affairs director, the TC stopped talking about it for a bit because we're just bashing our head off a brick wall. So that's the bit which we need to address, and maybe new institutional frameworks are part of the answer.
A very good note to end on. Look, colleagues, we have got to just about 1:30, but could I thank all our speakers from beginning to end, in particular, for giving up their time. They were all absolutely fascinating, and it was a very, very good workshop, I thought. I hope all the participants enjoyed it, and those who didn't actually get to contribute, nevertheless, were listening hard and enjoying it and getting plenty out of it. And finally, to thank IHR for hosting it, very importantly, and doing a very good job with that. So on that note, take care, everybody. Lovely to see you all.